Hope everybody's. It is a really pretty morning. It's a little cold, but I was fortunate enough to see a bunch of FPC people over the last, say, 12 to 16 hours. Helen and I we're both, as some of you know, big Davidson folks. So we went to the Davidson U of R game last night. Saw a bunch of FPC folks, and most of whom were cheering for the Spiders. I was in Rob Ukrop's class at Davidson, and he was one section over. And the new president of Davidson has taught here in the past. He was at U of R for many years, named Doug Hicks. And so he was there with his wife, Catherine, who used to teach at U of R. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, U of R commanded most of the game. Davidson came all the way back and tied, and then Davidson fouled the three-point shooter with 8 seconds left. And the guy made all 3 free throws. So good for you Spiders, bad for us Wildcats. But then we went over and saw more FPC. Yeah, we had Steph Curry. That's true. He's been gone a while though. But that is you say you went to Davidson, and the first thing that comes out of people's mouth is, oh my gosh, Steph Curry went there. We claim him proudly, actually, very much so. But then Helen and I went down and saw more FPC people at. We got there in time for the second half of the symphony and saw a bunch of wonderful friends from FPC there. So it was a fun evening, and I hope you had the same. So I'm going to allow this class a little more time for discussion than we've had the last couple of weeks, where I've been doing a bit more lecturing, but I do have to get a few things on the table. I did want to come back to, we're talking about hell today, or whether hell, does it exist? What does the Bible say about it? And we'll end on a more hopeful, optimistic note. But before I get to those slides, I wanted to come back, and there was a question last week that I glossed over too quickly, and I don't know if she's here, who asked the question about the Antichrist and how that relates to, I don't think so, how that relates to the Satan figure. It's a very good question, and the answer is that there's one passage in 1 John where this figure is referred to, or whoever it is, but it seems to be a collective group of wicked persons in the Bible. And the reason why I said no is because we shouldn't conflate the Antichrist figure that develops in early Christianity with the Satan, Diabolos, accuser figure of the Bible. The attempter figure in the Bible seems to be we talked about it as a special count. The person or the being is a special counsel, troublemaking angel, someone who's seeking to lead people, Jesus, or individuals from the straight and narrow path. A tempter figure, but it's not the same figure that we find in later Christianity, who is referred to as the Antichrist. That's a later development, so I wanted to pick up on that. So now we're going to talk about another uplifting topic, and that is whether a hell exists, and whether you think a hell exists, and we'll have some occasion to discuss it. There's been a lot written on this, obviously, and it's not something that in Presbyterian pulpits or Sunday schools we spend a whole lot of time on. But you all know, based on your upbringing and based on your knowledge, if you were brought up in a different tradition, you know that there's plenty of churches where the idea of eternal punishment, of hell, comes up a great deal. I mean, it is sort of the baseline assumption and reason you come to church, in order to avoid some sort of fiery, terrible punishment. Now, one of the things, there's some books I can recommend to you on this, but one of the things that we always want to pay attention to is what are the ancient sources, what do the ancient texts have to say about these matters. I want to raise a point to sort of say, I have been, and I will today, I'll be bringing in some texts that are not part of the Bible but are contemporaneous. Well, they're not part of our Bible. They are part, in some cases, with the first couple of examples, they're part of the Catholic canon. They were written before the Gospels, during the period, say, 3rd century to 1st century BCE, but they are incredibly important for helping us understand the framework out of which Judaism and Christianity developed. We're going to look at some passages from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which would be roughly contemporaneous with some of the New Testament texts. Incredibly important for helping us understand beliefs about whether there is some sort of eternal punishment. So I guess the point I'm making is, just because something is not in the Bible doesn't mean it cannot be instructive for helping us understand the world out of which the Bible and Christianity arose. We can't draw a glass bottle or a boundary around the Bible and say this is the only text we're going to look at for understanding the context out of which Jesus arose. Because we have a whole bunch of additional material, some of which is part of the Bible in Catholic and Orthodox tradition. In some cases, these are just ancient texts. So, technical point, but an important one. All right, so we've already talked about evil. We've already talked about this tempter figure who shows up in Job, who shows up in Matthew, who seems to be some sort of angel. I don't know whether we want to call him a fallen angel, but who is a troublemaker. Who seeks to steer us from the straight and narrow. Now, if we're going to think about evil in its broadest sense, we're often, our minds are going to go to what happens to us when we die if we are punished, if anything, and what does the ancient scripture and related texts say about that. So here are some examples. First of all, there is no uniform or depiction of some sort of punishment that is consistent across all of these texts. It varies, and more often than not, we just get passing references to what it might look like. It is, and it's constructed in our minds, and a lot of that construction happens based on things that came out, literature, movies, poems, whatever it might be, that came out far later than the Bible. A good example would be Dante's Inferno, which was obviously thousands of years later than the Bible, has influenced our understanding. So we want to be careful to say that there's a whole lot of diversity of perspective. There's not one sort of homogeneous idea of what it might look like. All right. One idea is that there really isn't a punishment or an afterlife for good or wicked people, that if you are righteous, you will live on in the memory of your descendants, your good name will live on, and you can die peacefully. And this was a very common belief in Judaism, and among many Jews and others, it continues to be a common belief. Here, but the idea of punishment would be, if I know I have been a crummy person, that God will afflict me with a sense of anxiety and regret on my deathbed that will exceed anything imaginable, that I will be so overcome with loss, regret, angst, that will exceed anything that I've experienced in my lifetime. It's easy for the Lord. This is from a 2nd century text we call Ben Sirach. It's easy on the day of a person's death to reward them according to their ways. A day's prosperity makes one forget suffering. A day's suffering makes one forget prosperity. A period of suffering will make one forget pleasure. A person's end tells their story. Do not declare a person happy before their death, for a person will be known by their end. The key verse here is 26, that God can afflict somebody, just take your pick of an evil figure within history, that God could afflict that person with such feelings of anxiety and guilt that they would be overcome by it, but still die like the rest of us. Not a particularly an understanding that has eternal consequences, but one that doesn't really have a belief in eternal punishment per se. All right. Another understanding is, this is a text that is roughly contemporaneous with the Jesus movement. This was written by a Jew living in Egypt, called under the banner of Solomon, but written in the 1st century CE. And he basically says that the wicked die, but by engaging in wicked behavior, they forfeit their chance for immortality, so that if you are wicked, you go into the ground, but you invite death by the wickedness of your ways. Don't invite death by the error of your life, or bring on destruction by the works of your hands, because God did not make death, and he does not delight in the death of the living, for he created all things so that they might exist. The generative forces of the world are wholesome, and there's no destructive poison in them, and the dominion of Hades is not on earth. For righteousness is immortal. The ungodly by their words and deeds summon death. Considering him a friend, they pined away and made a covenant with him because they are fit to belong in his company. Just one other passage here. The ungodly by their words and deeds summoned death. They pined away, made a covenant with him. They reasoned unsoundly, saying to themselves, short and sorrowful is our life. There's no remedy when a life comes to its end, and no one has been known to return from Hades. So the idea here is that if you are wicked and you believe there is no future afterlife, you would say, eat, drink, and be merry. Let's rob people. Let's oppress others. Let's engage in iniquitous behavior because there is no afterlife. And the person here, the author, is a Jewish figure who is under the influence of Hellenistic philosophy, who says, no, the soul is immortal, but it's only immortal if you're righteous. So if you are wicked, you then go into the earth. If you are righteous, you shine like the stars forever and ever. Make sense? Everybody with me? All right, another passage which is really interesting. This is the only reference in the Old Testament to individual immortality. And this is written in the 2nd century in the book of Daniel. And it's written during a period of persecution. The Jews are being persecuted by the Syrian ruler to their north, Antiochus IV. He made them eat pork. He rededicated the temple in Jerusalem to Zeus. He engaged in he killed a number of the Jews. And it's no coincidence that this apocalyptic understanding of an afterlife arose during a period of persecution. But for our present purposes, we want to focus on what's happening here. At that time, Michael, who's an angel, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There will be a time of anguish such as never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. You may not remember this. We talked about this briefly the first week. The idea is there is a book which contains all of our days, all of our deeds. Everything we've done is written in a book. And I talked about the fact there's some wonderful old Twilight Zone episodes of, where the guy who's done wrong goes up into the sky. And this was in the days when there's still filing cabinets and manila folders. And, there's a recounting of this figure's deeds. He's been a bank robber in a folder, and his angel/destructor shows him the folder. The idea is the same as we find in Daniel, that everything we have done is recounted in a book. And at a certain point at the end of days, we are going to be judged for it. That nothing we've done has gone unnoticed. So if you're written in the book, you're in good shape if you're judged to be righteous. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. You, Daniel, keep the word secret and the book sealed until the time of the end. This is very apocalyptic, the end of times, end of days, end of history. Many shall be running back and forth, and evil shall increase. So we'll pause on this for a minute. I'll see if you have any questions, but let me unpack it for just a second. The idea here is that what I refer to this as a double resurrection. Some people will be awakened to what we often call celestial immortality. Have you ever noticed how, when somebody, an icon of our world dies, someone will say, well, the stars just got a little bit brighter tonight. I remember when, Andy Griffith died, and, I loved Andy Griffith. I mean, full on Andy Griffith fan. But heaven gained another star today. I mean, that's something we say. That is an ancient conception of what we would call celestial immortality, meaning that the righteous will shine like the stars. They will have fellowship with the angels. They will have fellowship with the stars. And it's not really a physical resurrection. It is some sort of heavenly, glorious existence in a different, altered state. And there's lots of other examples of this in ancient texts. This is Daniel's understanding of it. Now, it also says, though, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Some will be awakened because they've been so wicked to some sort of eternal punishment. This is one of the earliest references of its type. It doesn't really specify what that's going to look like, but it says that it will be terrible and permanent and eternal. So it's one of the earliest references to what we might refer to as eternal punishment. Now, one question that's often asked here is, okay, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. If, say, Drake and I just cheated on our taxes, but, we were not so bad, but, maybe we didn't report everything, we led kind of a mediocre life. You just were in my line of thought. I'm not saying you're a tax cheat, Drake. Not about our plan here. That Drake and I wouldn't be necessarily awakened to everlasting contempt, that we would just stay asleep. It's only if you've been really bad that you're awakened, or if you've been really good that you're awakened. That's the sense here. But it does refer to some sort of eternal punishment, as well as eternal, glorious eternal life. All right, we looked at these last week. I'm just going to show them to you again. This is from the Dead Sea Scrolls, very similar. You have light, darkness, understanding. Those who are righteous will have everlasting blessing, eternal joy, and life without end, a crown of glory, and a garment of majesty and unending light. For those who are wicked, this is the light, darkness, understanding we talked about last week. If you're part of the lot of the sons of darkness, if you walk in the ways of wickedness, if you do bad things, your destiny will be eternal damnation for the scorching wrath of the God of revenge, for permanent error and shame without end, with the humiliation of destruction by the fire of the dark regions. Similar to what we see in some New Testament passages, the idea of weeping and gnashing of teeth, of fire. All days of their generations they shall spend in bitter weeping and harsh evils. Again, that similar to Matthew, in the abysses of darkness until their destruction, without them being a remnant or a survivor among them. Doesn't sound too great. So really a rough go for those who are part of the sons of darkness. So we do see glimpses here of the idea of some sort of eternal punishment that is based on earthly conduct. And I'm going to jump to the New Testament, and we're going to have plenty of time for discussion today. But let me stop. I felt like I threw too much at you last week, even though it was all important. And see, does anybody have any questions about any of those texts so far in terms of what they're describing, what they're envisioning, and how that shakes out? I can keep going, but I just want to make sure there's no questions. All right, let's come back. This is a slide we looked at last week. It doesn't seem to be the case that the Satan figure in the New Testament is the one who adjudicates the punishment. That figure is more of a tempter or a tester, the figure who takes Jesus out, who confronts Jesus out in the wilderness, who lures the unsuspecting into error, associated with the wide range of sins, pride, covetousness, friendship with the world. And then in Paul's letters, it seemed to be an afflicter of humanity, but not someone who is the judge and adjudicator, and in a sense, the one who controls the dominion in which eternal punishment occurs. That's not going to happen until a good bit later in the tradition. So this is more, the Satan figure in the New Testament is not the devil as we sometimes classically understand him. He's more of a tempter figure, or as somebody ably said last week, he's more of a special counsel appointed by a president with very extensive and open-ended duties, who can just keep digging and digging and digging. That's what he does in the New Testament. All right. But we do have references in the New Testament to how this might look. And what's interesting is the two things are interesting. One, it's not based on your theology or your doctrinal pronouncements. It's based on your earthly conduct. It's based on whether you were judged according to whether or not you're going to look out for the least of these. Are you going to be a person of upstanding character? Are you going to make sure the marginalized are taken care of? And two classic examples. One is in Luke 16, where I didn't put the whole passage on, but you know the story where the rich man walks by Lazarus each day, ignores him, and then when they both die, the rich man is sent into eternal punishment, and Lazarus rests in heaven with Jesus. And it's interesting, again, one interesting note here is it's not the Satan or the Diabolos figure who's pronouncing what's going to happen to the rich man. It's Abraham. It sort of comes out of nowhere, which is interesting. Remember, Abraham bargains with God over whether God's going to kill all the righteous people over the Sodom and Gomorrah episode. But Abraham is someone who shows up in this passage, and he calls out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I'm in agony in these flames." So we do see flames here. Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he's comforted here, and you were in agony. Besides all this, between you and us, notice here, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." That's pretty rough times, is it not? He can see into heaven, and he can see Lazarus resting with Jesus and Abraham, but he can't get there. It's like there's a plexiglass permanent chasm through which neither can cross. And if you remember, the next part in the story is the rich man does have a noble moment where he says, "Well, can we at least go warn my brothers?" And Abraham says, they've had the Torah, they've got the rules, they know what the deal is, they've heard Jesus' teachings. They have no excuse. So this is a pretty powerful passage, I think, and I'm sure you do as well, about justice, sharing of resources. It's a very pro-risk passage, right? By risk I mean R-I-S-C, Richmond, what First is involved in. I mean, it's very community engaged passage, but I raise it to sort of show the idea here that you have, just as you did in some of these earlier texts, some sort of fiery judgment that is uncomfortable, permanent, and involves eternal agony from which there is no escape. So we do find these passages in the New Testament. Another famous one in Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, right? Where we have this idea that Jesus says, those on my left, those on my right, the ones on my left, who did not tend to the widow, the orphan, the stranger, will be punished, and those on my right will. He will answer them at the end, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, you did to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." And there are passages in Matthew. The most famous refrain is the one with weeping and gnashing of teeth, similar to what we find in Luke. So, and again, what is really interesting about these passages is the notion that they involve, it's not, the basis for which direction you go is not what you confess or what you say, it's how you live your life, how you conduct yourself. Now, I guess it's relevant to say that the stakes, if we want to track this, the stakes are quite high, are they not? And we have to think about the ethical and theological implications of that. And that's what I'm going to talk about, and that's what I want us to spend some time on discussing. But let me go a little bit further before we do that. This belief from the New Testament would develop among the first Christians into a more extended understanding of what we might refer to as hell. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century says, "Hell's inhabitants will suffer punishments in eternal fire according to the merits of their deed," building on what we saw in Luke and Matthew and other related texts. Irenaeus, 20 years later, claimed that eternal fire is prepared for the sinner, that you are judged according to what you have done. Now, one thing that some of you have probably thought of as I've been talking about it, and certainly an aspect of this that is relevant in Catholicism, but we don't talk about very much, is what about purgatory? Is there a sense, do we have an understanding of that in Presbyterian Reformed tradition? Not particularly, but it is something that some of you who have had experience with Catholicism will certainly know about. This is the baseline text for that understanding. So this is from a Second Maccabees, which is a Jewish text, but the idea here is that Judas Maccabee, one of the heroes of the text, said to the people, "Keep yourselves from sin." He took up a collection, person by person, man by man, to the amount of 2,000 drachmas of silver, sent it to Jerusalem to provide for a sin offering. In doing this, he acted very well and honorably, taking account of the resurrection. This is like Daniel and Luke and Matthew. This text believes in resurrection. For if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. But if he was looking to the splendid reward that is laid up for those who fall asleep in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Therefore he made atonement for the dead so that they might be delivered from their sin. That's the key line, making atonement for the dead so that they might be delivered from their sin. Now, the purgatorial understanding is complicated. It developed over a lengthy time, but there are early passages in which the deceased are held in sort of a holding area, whether it's in a state of rest, whether it's in some sort of holding pen, or in this case, they seem to have already gone into their eternal rest. But there is a belief here that if they are prayed for, if they are atoned for at a certain point, just as we found in Daniel, there will be an end of time when they will be raised into some sort of eternal existence. So there is a belief, and it's especially prevalent, as you know, within Catholicism, that for many people there is a need for purification before entering the kingdom of Christ. It is not something that is resonant or particularly affirmed in our theology in the Presbyterian Church, but it's certainly something that has its passages in the ancient world and then certainly in Catholic tradition. All right, but what's the problem here? And this is where I want to pause and talk about whether, and I'll end on a hopeful note, but I want to have some discussion on this. There's a theological, ethical problem, is there not? And I'm borrowing from a really interesting book that is quite accessible by a scholar named Sharon Baker, who wrote a book called Raising Hell, Razing, saying that it's a problematic concept. She says, the idea of hell exacerbates evil by keeping the wicked perpetually in existence. If hell exists eternally, so does evil, and so does the suffering of untold numbers of people whom God supposedly loves and desires to redeem. That it is problematic theologically to argue that the gracious God we worship would believe in the idea of eternal divine violence, that something someone could have done is so awful that they would deserve to suffer forever and ever and ever. And, well, you might say, well, some people deserve it, but and I'm sure some of you are thinking that, and I am too about some people. But the flip side to that is, what about the vast majority of us who are broken sinners, who have done bad things in our lives, but who rely on the promise of the redemption and grace of God that is extended to us? How do we square a belief in hell and these difficult passages with the notion that this would then affirm that the God who supposedly desires to redeem each one of us would allow that punishment and the consequences and suffering of that punishment to persist, not just indefinitely, but for all time? That is a very difficult thing to affirm and square with some of the more positive, redemptive aspects of God that we also affirm. Those two things are not sitting together easily. So let me stop there. I've got another slide I'm going to show, but let's talk about that for a minute. Do you see the same tension I do between, okay, what are we going to do with these passages that we find in Matthew 25 and Luke 16, but doesn't Baker raise a good point as well? That you do have this problem of what does that say about the universe and about God, and just about the whole problem of what happens to those who have not conducted themselves the way they might have. Do we really want to affirm that punishment is permanent, unending, eternal, and unbridgeable, unfixable? That's I think. I don't know about you, but for me, that is sort of a critical crossroads of faith that I struggle with all the time, and think about all the time. And I think Lent is an especially good time to think about it. Jesus is off in the wilderness being tempted by the Diabolos figure, so it's a good idea for us to take stock and sort of think about these existential questions. So let's do that for a few minutes. So thoughts, questions, responses. I can't imagine you don't have thoughts on this. Yes, Steve.
Purgatory. The Catholic, I think what the Vatican built was indulgences.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then, when they started running out of, they started to pay for people that were dead,
It became a racket. Yeah.
racket.
Yeah.
But the whole concept of you could earn your way out of hell in this interim
Yeah.
spot.
You could buy your way out. But I don't think, that's what is, what was I'm going to get the quote wrong. Things that start off as a cause morph into a business and turn into a racket. That's the way most things go. But that certainly was the case, especially in the medieval church and during the period of the Reformation. It's one of the things that the reformers were incensed about. But that's a human sort of interesting story. I'm more interested in the theological question, and the theological question is, how do we account? Is there a way? Are there any texts? And there are some. I've shown you one from Maccabees. There's others from the early church that would suggest perhaps there's a way for the wicked, for the sinners, to in effect atone for what they have done as a means of entering some sort of blessed immortality. To me, that's the theological question's the more interesting one. I do find it to be a somewhat attractive concept. There are some texts that, and I didn't put it on there, but there is a text that is roughly, again, contemporaneous with the New Testament called First Enoch. And in this text, those who die are basically put in these pits in which they hang out until the end of days. And then the angel's going to come and enact some sort of resurrection. So you're in kind of a holding pen. Now, the Catholic Church is very clear to say that purgatory is not like some, bad summer camp where you hang out for 1,000 years until your time comes. That it's not a particularly alert, awake state, but it's just a period of repose before where you have to atone for what you've done in order to enter the pearly gates. But I want to come back, though, to this question of, let me ask it this way. Baker says that was asked, there was a poll that came out, and actually I did this poll. This was a mistake. Was it a Pew poll? Because then I got on the list, but it was a heaven and the afterlife poll that I participated in back, and I was in grad school. I was like, oh my gosh, I got to do it. But the question was asked, do you believe in some sort of hell? And the answer among Americans at the time was 62% do. And then, but among those who go to church regularly, it was a good bit higher than that. Now, I would guess that among Presbyterians, that number's lower. I'm not sure of that, but let's take a straw poll if you're willing to vote. How many of you believe in some sort of eternal punishment? Little bit? No, you don't know? I don't really know either.
It's predestined.
Predestined? No, I'm asking serious questions. Like it is. I mean, we have these passages. Let me ask it this way. What do we do with these passages in Luke and Matthew? Which seem to suggest that there is a great chasm and there is a possibility. If you have been, if you have listened to this tempter figure, that the stakes are really, really high. And that, we talked the first week about what gives us the inclination or desire to listen to the tempter figure. Well, something does, because we're all prone to it. But let me ask it this way: how do you respond to these tricky passages? How have you thought about them in the past? Yeah.
It's not inconsistent, but it seems potentially that all of these passages are built up to the story of the cross. It's a story of the cross. Jesus sin is taken up.
Absolutely.
With the two criminals who
Yeah, no, that's true.
evil things
Yes.
are redeemed as well.
That's true. And I agree with that. So the idea here, and that's a good point, and I was thinking about that too, that you do have that beautiful scene with Jesus and the criminals who are able to obtain redemption in their final breaths. And that does, I think, inspire us, and I'm going to show some additional passages that inspire us with the hope that God's redeeming love through Jesus is the thing that not just saves us, but saves the world. Now, I'm going to, just as Sandy knows, I tend to then follow that up with in good Socratic fashion with something that complexifies things. What's the first thing Jesus does in Acts at the, Pentecost happens, but Jesus ascends into heaven in Acts 2, and what is his role there when he ascends to heaven? He's judge. After he ascends, he appears before the disciples on the road to Emmaus, meets with them, he ascends into heaven, and he says, I'm going to sit next to God and adjudicate the righteous and the wicked. So that aspect of Jesus' ministry and what he does is still part of the story. So we have to figure out what we want to do. But the point about the criminals, I think, is a really important one, that there is redemption available for sure. Russ, you had your hand up. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, and I think that's right. I mean, you do have, we can't cover everything, and I'm trying to, take us to places where we don't often lodge. Presbyterians don't talk about hell, particularly, it's interesting that we don't, because we tend to focus on grace, and I think rightfully so. It's one of the reasons I think we're all Presbyterians, that our tradition is built on the notion that we are a priesthood of all believers, that none of us is more, to come back to the Catholic point, none of us is more great or little than the other. And as Paul says in Romans, we are justified by grace through faith. It is not because of anything we do or don't do. We're all broken sinners. We have to believe as the criminal did. And through that belief, God's grace overcomes our brokenness. I don't want to deny that. What I do want to say is, what about Luke 16 and Matthew 25? What do we do with those? Because that's in the Bible too. What do we do with the fact that Father Abraham says, you didn't do right, and now you can't get through the plexiglass? And how do we respond to that? Is that maybe part of the universe as well? I don't know. The other thing I think it's important to say is that another really wonderful aspect of our tradition is that we're not in the business of adjudicating who's going where. We don't get to decide that. It's not in our capacity. It is not our role to decide that. That's what God gets to do. Only thing we can do is try to live as faithfully as we can, as mutually supportive with each other as we can, and to leave God's role to God. It is not our place. And that is something that separates us from some of the, sometimes late at night. Well, I don't have cable anymore, which is probably a good thing. But back in the day, I used to sometimes wander up to the Home Shopping Network and the televangelists. You flip around the televangelist. Now I just see him at my buddy who cleans my suits, who's always got those shows on, and I always chat with him. And I pause for a minute to see what's being said about hell on those stations. But you don't have to go far along the dial to get a much more fire and brimstone sermon than Amy is going to preach this morning. I don't know who's preaching. Is Amy preaching? We're not going to hear fire and brimstone from Amy this morning. And that's, I think, a good thing. But I guess I would say that aspect of belief in afterlife, either good or bad, is part of Christian tradition, and there are some passages that attest to it. And we're wrestling with them. Yeah, there was a hand here.
So I need to go back a little bit because I have two basic problems with all these descriptions of hell and even evil.
Yeah.
But one big one is we've got all these physical descriptions, which are metaphors, which are totally inadequate.
Yes.
Because we're talking about spiritual concepts, and these are trying to convert them into physical concepts. The other problem I have with evil, and you're talking about what we're responsible for when we live and so forth. What happens when you have an illness? And I'm a retired physician, so I
Yeah.
think this all the time. When you have an illness, it totally changes your personality or your ability to live.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And
Yeah.
what happens
Oh, absolutely. Oh, but those are,
without getting into the political
yeah, no, that's a, yeah,
just the simple concepts like that. So,
yeah.
I mean, come back to what you just said about.
No, those are, Drake, we're out of time now? Is that, I'm kidding. Those are huge, outstanding questions. Let's take them in reverse order, and others can respond. And as most of you know, Helen is a physician. I think she's got a patient on call. She's in the car dealing with. She'll come home and obviously doesn't tell me the patient's name, but she tells me that all the time. That it is unfathomable how certain illnesses can afflict certain folks that change not just their lives, but in some cases change their sort of understanding of reality, existence, and sometimes they might morph into a new person. Yes, yeah. Now, I guess there's where we turn to Job, and there's where we turn to a lack of understanding about why certain things happen the way they do. I mean, Job is perplexed. He hasn't done anything wrong, and the universe and some of what happens in it is just beyond our comprehension. And we can't, in some cases, we can't provide adequate answers ethically or theologically to why certain things happen. That would be a parade example as to why a certain illness would afflict somebody and not another. Job's friends say, well, it must be because you did something wrong, because God only punishes in accordance with what someone has done. And Job says, no, that's wrong. And God comes out of the whirlwind at the end and tells the friends they've been too doctrinal and too rigid, but then says to Job, yeah, you don't understand everything that goes on in the universe, so you need to just get back to being a human being. God doesn't really answer that question. It sort of says, hey, I made the ostrich and the whale, and the universe is a big place, and you don't understand that everything that goes on. And that's about all God says. Now, on the first question, I would not want to suggest that evil is completely a spiritual concept. I'd have to pull up I don't agree with, you have to flesh out a little bit more what you were trying to say, because I do think that, and some of these passages would say, human beings can in effect evoke or bring evil to a situation by virtue of our sinfulness and brokenness and greed and envy. And there's some passages we showed 2 weeks ago that sort of says, hey, don't say it's God who caused me to sin, because God doesn't do what God hates. That sin is a function in Genesis and elsewhere. God instills in us like basically two inclinations, and it's up to us whether we're going to listen to the good inclination or the bad inclination. And our lifetime is, what we're doing in life is a constant struggle. Are we going to listen to the light or the darkness that is inside each of us? And so it's a spiritual concept, but it's also an ethical set of decisions each one of us faces every day. Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't mean that, but what I was trying to get to is, when you die, you're gonna leave every bit of your body, your physical
Yes.
body behind.
Yeah.
And all these metaphors for hell are based on your physical, evil certainly is not just a spiritual concept.
Oh, no, I agree with that. No, that's a good point. That's a really good point. Now it raises another issue, and that is, and this is a death in the. We're touching on death in the afterlife, which we can't help but do if we're going to talk about evil and Satan and all these things. So that's why we're dealing with it. And if we had another week, I got sick the first week, we would talk more, about how does evil play out in relation to heaven. Today we're talking about hell. I'll talk. We're going to end on a hopeful note. The one question here is what sort of existence does one have either in heaven or in some sort of state? Now, if we go back to Daniel, it seems that you don't have a physical body. You have some sort of spiritual. Your soul may survive in the sense, my Samness survives, whether in a blessed celestial state or in wherever the wicked go. Here it also seems to be the case that whatever type of physical existence you have, it's going to be. Now, we don't know, basically what we don't know from these texts, because they don't tell us, is how corporeal is it going to be. By corporeal, I mean how much of a physical body are you going to have? Matthew and Luke and the other passages don't really focus on that very much. It does seem that Lazarus has some sort of body because he's able to rest in the bosom of Abraham. The rich man has some sort of body because he is in agony. He's able to feel physical pain, but the text doesn't describe that. Paul goes into greater detail, but that would take the rest of our time if I started talking about that. So, these are interesting questions. Now, I haven't talked about Revelation, where in the book of Revelation, where if you are wicked, you go into a big sulfur pool, and that would be very painful. So the idea is that, and then if you're among the elect category, you live in the New Jerusalem where it's light all the time, that it never becomes dark, and you're in a blessed city. So it's a somewhat different understanding in Revelation, where you do seem to have some sort of bodily existence. Other questions? Thoughts?
They're selling lots by the lake of fire on the internet.
Well, are you going to buy one? Well, it is a. We joke about it, and it's something it's something that you can't help. If you're going to talk about something with eternal consequences, it's almost too big of a thing to fathom. I mean, to wonder about, is it, to think about the stakes involved is such a mammoth thing. I don't think we're able to comprehend it, because we're talking about moving to a state, whether it's blessed or a punishment, whether it's a reward or a punishment, that is in effect timeless. Because if we're going to say there's eternal consequences, our sense of temporality is going to be very different in that state. So I think it's very difficult for us to, it's impossible for us to fathom that, I guess I would say. Other questions, thoughts on this? Yeah, Russ. Oh, well, Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because it definitely wasn't that such a sea change in the history of humanity, because we developed. I mean, the Bible has stories, the flood being the most prominent among them, but it's also in Daniel where, the idea is that the world's going to be destroyed, and that either God will send a flood to punish the earth, or at the end of days, everything's going to be destroyed, and then God will inaugurate a new age. There's something very apocalyptic about Oppenheimer, because for the first time we developed the capacity to destroy the planet. So, didn't that, in a sense, inaugurate to come back to the question, I think it's probably no coincidence that the decades succeeding that, there was a greater interest in apocalypticism, Revelation. You had all those Left Behind books that came out. I think you could say there's a corollary there, that people began to understand that we had the capacity to blow up everything, and so they began to think about the eternal consequences of that. I think that's absolutely right. So, we're still living in the shadow of that. We were, who was I walking with? Maybe Helen and I were walking. We were trying to think of who were the most, consequential people who ever lived on the planet, in terms of, the changes they wrought. And I think you have to put Oppenheimer on any list, right? Just the stakes. I brought up Watson and Crick and the DNA stuff, but certainly Jesus. But yeah, that you'd have to put Oppenheimer on the list. What was the other one? Somebody said something. All right. Anyway.
You said Jesus. I said, nah.
Oh, okay. So I want to end on a hopeful note, that the steadfast love of God is what we ultimately affirm. And that, I think, to come back to your point, a lot of these metaphors, understandings, depictions of what eternal punishment might look like are a means of trying to instill good behavior in this life. They are teaching methods. They are a didactic, a pedagogical tool to stay on the straight and narrow, tend to the less fortunate, do good works, because that's going to make fellowship work better. Now, I don't doubt that some of those who were responsible for the Bible and related ancient texts did believe in eternal punishment, but we also have to say that the overriding theme of the God we worship is a more positive, steadfast, redemptive understanding. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Psalm 23. Love when we read that in church, at funerals, wherever. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that whoever believes in him may not perish but have eternal life. This gets to your question, Russ's point. There is a redemption offered in Jesus Christ, that we are all broken sinners, and that our theology affirms that we are unable to effect our own salvation through works. It is only through God's redemptive and unending grace that we are offered eternal life. And that is fundamental to not just our tradition, but I think it's fundamental to the Bible. And I believe that, and I think and hope most of us, or all of us, do. Where it becomes difficult is to think about, okay, we do have areas of Christianity and we do have passages in the Bible that deal with the thorny question of the questions you were asking. How do certain things afflict some people and not others? Who placed in us the inclination to want to do bad things? If we believe in an all-powerful, omnipotent, transcendent, gracious God, why did the woman and the man want to eat the apple? And why do we have the inclination to go across town and do bad things? Where did that come from? Who put that here? If God created everything, what do we do with this tempter figure in the Bible? And what do we do with these passages that say that some people are not going to attain the existence, the heavenly existence they so desire? I think, let me close by saying this, and I think now we are almost at time. The Bible, these passages I would have on any top 10 list of, what do we believe about our faith? What do we affirm about our faith? I mean, these are certainly three of my favorites, and I'd venture to say they're yours as well. And these provide answers. They provide answers to the question of who God is and how do we relate to God and who is Jesus Christ. These provide fundamental answers to the faith. But there's also difficult questions that are unanswerable, that are existential, and that we each struggle with throughout our lives, because we're all going to experience misfortune and we're all going to have these questions. The Bible doesn't always provide answers. Sometimes, as I've tried to do in this class, it helps us frame the questions to ask. Does that make sense? The Bible sometimes helps us ask the right questions rather than provide the absolute verifiable answer. Because there is mystery in the world. There's mystery to our existence, and there is mystery whenever we ask the question of where does evil come from. And I can't answer that question in 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 years. So maybe I'll stop there because I've said I can't answer the question. Any last comments on that? All right, it's always great to be with y'all, and this was a heavy topic. Maybe next time we'll go back to movies or take up something a little lighter. But it is Lent, so really enjoyed the conversation as ever, and hope you enjoy the rest of your beautiful Sunday. Oh, I'm going to be gone, but I just a plug for my colleague Safwat. I mean, he grew up in Egypt and is just going to have a really interesting, insightful perspective and a timely one on what's happening he's just well plugged in with events on the ground. So I highly recommend coming for him. I'll watch it on the video. So that's great that he's coming.